When my phone lit up 3 days after Mother's Day, I thought it was finally the call I'd been pretending not to wait for. I remember exactly where I was standing, by the kitchen sink, one hand wrapped around a chipped blue mug, the other resting on the counter where the wood had worn smooth over the years. The house was quiet in that way it only gets when you live alone long enough to stop noticing the silence. Outside, a lawnmower hummed somewhere down the street, steady and indifferent. The name on my screen wasn't Happy Mother's Day. It wasn't even, How are you, Mom? It was, Hey, Mom, we need to talk. I stared at the words longer than I should have, long enough for the coffee to cool, long enough for my chest to tighten in that familiar place right beneath the ribs where disappointment had learned to live comfortably. 3 days earlier, my phone hadn't buzzed at all. No call, no message, not even a stiff last-minute text with a flower emoji attached. Mother's Day came and went like any other Sunday, except this one carried a weight I couldn't quite shake. I spent it the way I'd spent many holidays lately, quietly, carefully, telling myself stories to make the emptiness feel intentional. I didn't answer the call right away. I set the phone down, face up, like it might explain itself if I waited long enough. Before things went wrong, before the silence, before the asking, I used to think I'd done all right as a mother. Not perfect, never perfect, but present. I raised 2 children mostly on my own after their father and I separated when they were teenagers. Mark was 17 then, already taller than his dad, already convinced he knew better. Emily was 14, softer around the edges, still willing to sit at the kitchen table with me and talk while I chopped onions for dinner. We lived in a modest 3-bedroom house with creaky stairs and a backyard that never quite stayed green no matter how hard I tried. I worked as an office administrator for a small logistics company. Nothing fancy, but steady. The kind of job where people knew your name and noticed when you brought lemon loaf to the break room. Money was tight, but love wasn't. At least that's how it felt back then. I remember Friday nights when I'd come home tired, shoes kicked off by the door, and find the kids sprawled on the living room floor with takeout cartons and homework spread everywhere. Mark would look up and say, "Hey, Mom," like it mattered that I'd walk through the door. Emily would ask if I was hungry, even though she knew I always was. Those memories still visit me sometimes, uninvited and sharp around the edges. As they got older, life did what life does. It pulled us in different directions. Mark married young. His wife, Lauren, was polite but distant, the kind of woman who smiled without using her eyes. Emily moved to another state for work, chasing opportunities I'd always encouraged her to take. I told myself this was normal. Children grow, mothers learn to let go. Still, I held on to small rituals, Sunday calls, birthday cards with handwritten notes, holiday dinners whenever schedules allowed. I never stopped being the one who reached out first, but I didn't mind, or at least I told myself I didn't. Mother's Day used to be simple. Breakfast cards, a short visit, maybe a small plant I'd keep on the windowsill until it died from my forgetfulness. Over time, the gestures got smaller. A call instead of a visit, a text instead of a call. This year, there was nothing. I woke up early that Sunday, the way I always do, made myself toast, burnt because I got distracted staring out the window. I kept my phone nearby, volume up, telling myself not to be silly. That night, I didn't sleep much. I lay in bed staring at the faint crack in the ceiling that I'd been meaning to fix for years, listening to the house settle around me. Every creak sounded louder than usual. Every thought stretched out, refusing to be ignored. I kept replaying the call in my head, not just what they said, but how they said it. The rushed explanation, the way Lauren jumped in so quickly as if she were managing the conversation. The assumption, sitting quietly between us, that of course I would say yes. You've always been good at helping us land on our feet." I wondered when that became my defining role. The next morning, I made my usual breakfast, oatmeal with a little too much cinnamon, and carried it to the small table by the window. The chair across from me stayed empty, as it always did, but that morning I noticed it more. I noticed how often I'd filled spaces for other people while quietly shrinking my own. I decided not to rush my answer. That in itself felt like a small act of rebellion. Over the next few days, little things began to bother me, things I might have brushed off before. Emily still hadn't called. I told myself she might be busy, different time zones and all that, but when I checked social media one evening, I saw pictures she'd posted from a brunch that Sunday, smiling, laughing, tagged with friends. Mother's Day brunch. I stared at the photo longer than I should have, the glow from my phone lighting up the darkened living room. I wasn't angry, not exactly. I felt misplaced, like I'd been quietly removed from a story I thought I was still part of. Mark called again 2 days later. "Did you get a chance to think about it?" he asked, not bothering with pleasantries. "Yes," I said, "I did." "And?" His voice carried that same careful edge, the one that tried to sound respectful while pressing forward. "I have some questions," I replied. There was a pause, a longer one this time. "What kind of questions?" Lauren asked in the background. I sat down on the couch, smoothing the fabric beside me out of habit. "What exactly happened? You said it was temporary, but you didn't explain why you suddenly need that much money." Mark hesitated. "It's just some expenses piled up. Car trouble, a few things with the house." "The house?" I asked. "I thought you refinanced last year." Another pause. I could almost see him glance at Lauren, seeking approval or direction. "Well," he said slowly, "things didn't work out the way we expected." I didn't push further then, not because I believed him, but because I could feel the conversation tightening. When we hung up, I had the distinct sense that I had stepped slightly out of line, and they'd noticed. That feeling followed me for days. At work, I found myself distracted, rereading the same email over and over without absorbing it. On my lunch break, I walked to the small park across the street and sat on a bench watching people pass by. Mothers with strollers, adult children walking beside aging parents, leaning in close as they talked. I wondered when the balance had shifted so quietly. That weekend, I decided to do something I hadn't done in a long time. I pulled out my old checkbook and financial folder, the one I'd kept tucked away in the bottom drawer of my desk. Inside were bank statements, insurance papers, notes I'd scribbled to myself over the years. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for. Maybe reassurance, maybe clarity. I didn't sleep at all that night. The word sold kept floating to the surface of my thoughts like a bruise you keep pressing just to confirm it's still there. I got up twice, once to make tea I never finished, and once to stand at the window and stare out at the quiet street. The houses across from mine sat peacefully, their lights off, unaware of the slow unraveling happening inside my chest. By morning, I wasn't panicked. I was focused. There's a difference I didn't fully understand until that moment. I printed the property record and slid it into my purse before work. The paper felt heavier than it should have, like it carried more than ink and numbers. At the office, I went through the motions, answered phones, scheduled meetings, smiled when expected, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying years of trust with a new filter. At lunch, I called Mark. He didn't answer. I left a voicemail, my tone calm, measured. "I need you to call me back. Today." He returned the call that evening. "Hey, Mom," he said, too casually. "Everything okay?" "Yes," I replied. "I was just looking over some things and got a bit confused." "Confused about what?" I took a breath. "About the house." Silence. You said you were struggling with payments, I continued, but according to public records, the house was sold 3 months ago. The pause on the other end wasn't just hesitation, it was calculation. Mom, he began. Don't, I said quietly. Please don't start with excuses yet. I just want to understand. Lauren's voice slipped in, sharp and controlled. Why were you looking that up? That question told me everything I needed to know. I wanted clarity, I said, because you're asking me for a lot of money. Mark sighed. We didn't think it was relevant. Relevant, I repeated. You told me you needed help because of the house. Well, we do, Lauren said quickly. We're renting now, and rent is expensive, plus there were other things. Like what? I asked. More silence, longer this time. I could feel the shape of the truth forming even if they hadn't said it yet. The way Lauren took over the conversation, the way Mark let her, the way they'd both avoided specifics. Mom, Mark finally said, his voice softer now, we didn't skip Mother's Day on purpose. I almost laughed. Almost. I said you didn't call, not even a text. We were dealing with the move. Everything happened so fast. 3 months, I replied. You had 3 months. The line went quiet again. When Lauren spoke, her tone had changed, less defensive, more rehearsed. We just didn't want to worry you. I closed my eyes. You didn't want to remind yourselves, I said. There's a difference. After we hung up, I sat alone in the living room, the weight of it all finally settling in. The betrayal wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no cruel words thrown like weapons. It was quieter than that. It was the realization that my role in their lives had shifted without my consent, from mother to resource. The next day, I did something else I'd never done before. I said nothing. I didn't call back. I didn't text. I didn't explain myself. Instead, I met with my bank advisor. She was a kind woman in her 40s with careful eyes and a voice that never rushed. As she reviewed my accounts, she nodded slowly, occasionally tapping her pen against the desk. You've been very disciplined, she said. You could help them if you wanted to. If I wanted to, I repeated. The morning I decided what I was going to do, the air felt different. Not lighter, just clearer, like after a storm when everything looks sharper than it did before. I made coffee and drank it slowly, standing by the window, watching a woman down the street walk her dog in small, patient circles. Ordinary life continuing, unaware that something inside me had shifted. I didn't want revenge. That surprised me. What I wanted was truth, out in the open, no soft edges left to hide behind. I called Mark and asked him to come by that evening, just him and Lauren, no explanations over the phone, no negotiating. There was a pause before he agreed. Is this about the money? He asked. It's about us, I said. All of us. They arrived just after 6. I heard their car before I saw it, the crunch of tires on gravel, the slam of a door that sounded a little too forceful. When I opened the front door, Lauren stood stiffly beside Mark, her arms crossed tight against her chest. Come in, I said. They sat on the couch, close together, as if bracing for impact. I took the armchair across from them, leaving the coffee table between us like a quiet boundary. I want to help you, but not the way you're asking. Lauren's mouth tightened. What does that mean? It means, I said evenly, I won't give you money under false pretenses. Mark shifted. We weren't lying. You weren't telling the whole truth, I replied, and that matters. I reached for the folder I'd prepared and set it on the table. Inside were copies of the property record, bank statements, and a list of every time I'd helped them financially in the past. Lauren leaned forward, her eyes flicking over the pages. Why would you do this? Because I deserve honesty, I said, and because I need you both to understand something. Mark rubbed his hands together, a nervous habit from his childhood. Mom, we're not trying to hurt you. I know, I said softly. That's the problem. They looked at me then, really looked, not as the dependable fallback, not as the quiet helper in the background, as someone who was tired. I will help, but only with conditions. Lauren straightened. Conditions? Yes, I met her gaze without flinching. First, I want transparency, full transparency, no more half stories, no more convenient omissions. Mark nodded slowly. Second, I said, this help won't be a gift, it will be a loan, documented, with a repayment plan. Lauren opened her mouth to protest, but I held up a hand. And third, I said, my voice steady, I need an apology, not for the money, for Mother's Day. The room went very still. Mark looked down at the floor. Lauren stared at the wall. We didn't think it mattered that much, Lauren said finally. I smiled sadly. That's exactly why it does. Mark swallowed. I'm sorry, Mom, he said roughly. I should have called. I should have shown up. I waited. Lauren's apology came slower, more measured. I'm sorry, too, she said. We didn't mean to make you feel overlooked. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. After they left, I felt oddly calm. I hadn't raised my voice, I hadn't begged, I hadn't folded myself smaller to keep the peace. 2 days later, the family group chat lit up. Emily had heard. Why are you making things so hard? They're already stressed. I took a deep breath before responding. I'm not making things hard, I'm making them honest. The messages that followed came quickly, defensive, emotional, layered with years of unspoken expectations. I didn't respond to all of them. I didn't need to. What I hadn't expected was how the truth would spread. At a family gathering the following weekend, my sister's birthday, Mark and Lauren arrived late. The mood was strained, the smiles a little too fixed. Conversations dipped and rose awkwardly around us. Someone asked casually, So, how's the new place? Lauren froze. Mark answered a little too quickly, It's fine. But I thought you moved months ago. Didn't you sell the house in March? The room went quiet. Lauren's eyes flicked to me. I said nothing. The shock wasn't loud. It was a slow realization moving through the room, glances exchanged, truths piecing together selves without. After that gathering, things changed in subtle but unmistakable ways. No one confronted me directly, no accusations were hurled across the room, but the tone shifted. Conversations that once flowed easily now carried pauses. Questions were asked more carefully. People listened differently. Mark called me 2 days later. They know, he said simply. Yes, I replied, they do. He sighed. I didn't mean for it to come out like that. I didn't make it come out at all, I said. I just stopped covering. There was a long pause, then quieter. Lauren's embarrassed. I closed my eyes. I imagine she is. What he didn't say, but what hung between us, was that embarrassment often follows when truth meets daylight. They didn't ask me for the money again, not right away. Instead, Mark began calling more often. Short conversations at first, neutral topics, the weather, work, small bridges being rebuilt, plank by plank. Emily, on the other hand, stayed distant. Weeks passed, summer crept in slowly, the days stretching longer, the evenings warmer. I found myself spending more time outside, tending to the small garden I'd neglected. Pulling weeds felt grounding, honest. You see the mess, you remove it, and you don't apologize for the dirt under your nails. One afternoon, my sister stopped by unexpectedly. She stood in my doorway, hands on her hips, eyes soft but searching. You all right? She asked. Yes, I said, and for the first time in a long while, it wasn't a lie. She nodded. Good, because I wanted you to know I'm glad you didn't bail them out without asking questions." I blinked. "You are?" She smiled faintly. "You've always been the one who fixes things. Someone had to stop you." Her words stayed with me. A month later, Mark and Lauren invited me to their rental. It was smaller than their old place, tidy but sparse, like a space still waiting to be claimed. Lauren offered me tea, her movements more tentative than I remembered. "We've been adjusting," she said. "I can see that," I replied. Mark sat across from me at the small kitchen table. "We've made a budget," he said. "We're figuring it out." I nodded. "I'm glad." There was a pause, then Lauren spoke. "We don't expect you to help anymore." I looked at her, really looked. "I know," I said, "and that's a good start." The shock they'd experienced wasn't financial, it was relational. It was the realization that access to me came with responsibility. Later that night, Emily finally called. "I didn't realize how much pressure you were under," she said, her voice softer than it had been in weeks. "I just assumed you were fine." "I was managing," I replied. "There's a difference." "I'm sorry. For Mother's Day, for all of it." I let the silence stretch, then said, "Thank you." That was enough. As summer turned toward fall, something unexpected happened. I started planning things for myself. A short trip I'd postponed for years, new furniture for the living room, small joys that didn't require permission or justification. The savings account I'd guarded so carefully wasn't just security anymore, it was possibility. I didn't stop being a mother, I just stopped being invisible. At the next Mother's Day, I didn't wait by the phone. Mark and Lauren showed up unannounced that morning, That second Mother's Day wasn't perfect. It wasn't wrapped in grand gestures or emotional speeches. There were no dramatic apologies or tears soaking into my shoulder. But it was real, and that mattered more to me than anything else. They stayed for coffee. Lauren asked about my garden, genuinely this time, kneeling to look at the herbs like she wanted to understand what kept my hands busy these days. Mark fixed the loose hinge on my kitchen cabinet without being asked. Emily stayed on the call longer than planned, asking questions about a trip I was considering, listening instead of multitasking. When they left, the house didn't feel emptier. It felt settled. That was when I realized the loudest changes often happen quietly. The real consequence of everything that happened wasn't embarrassment or strained conversations. It was the shift in expectations. They no longer assumed my yes, and I no longer offered it automatically. Over the months that followed, Mark and Lauren figured things out on their own. They sold furniture they didn't need, took on extra work, learned the uncomfortable art of saying no to themselves and to others. Sometimes Mark would mention how hard it was. "I didn't realize how much we relied on you," he admitted once over the phone. "I didn't either," I said, until I stopped. Emily visited that fall. We sat at the same kitchen table where I'd once helped her with homework, now drinking tea like two adults learning each other again. "I used to think strength meant never needing anything," she said quietly. "But watching you, I think it means knowing when to stop giving." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. It took me a long time to learn that. There were still moments that stung. Old habits don't disappear overnight. Occasionally a request would slip through, a hint, a suggestion, a carefully worded ask. But now I paused. I asked questions. I listened to my own discomfort instead of pushing it aside. And each time I did, something inside me stood a little taller. The public consequence, the part everyone else saw, was subtle but lasting. At family gatherings, stories were told more honestly. Assumptions were challenged. I was no longer spoken about as if I weren't in the room. Once I overheard my sister say to a cousin, "She finally stopped rescuing everyone. Best thing she ever did." I didn't correct her. Healing didn't come all at once. It came in moments, in mornings where I drank my coffee without checking my phone, in evenings where I chose rest over obligation, in the quiet pride of knowing my kindness had boundaries now and that those boundaries made it stronger, not weaker. I didn't regret helping my children in the past. Love given freely is never a mistake. But I did regret how long it took me to understand that love shouldn't cost you your voice. Looking back, the shock of their lives wasn't about money at all. It was about losing access to something they'd taken for granted. And the shock of mine? Realizing I was allowed to change. I was allowed to say no without explanation, allowed to expect care in return, allowed to stop performing motherhood as sacrifice and start living it as connection. Now, when Mother's Day comes around, I don't measure it by calls or cards. I measure it by how I feel in my own skin. Calm, grounded, seen. And if the phone rings late or not at all, I know this. My worth doesn't depend on who remembers me last. It lives in the quiet strength I carry forward every day. The real healing didn't announce itself. It didn't arrive with a dramatic apology or a sudden transformation in anyone else. It came slowly, in pieces so small I almost missed them at first. It came the morning I woke up and realized I hadn't thought about that phone call, the one after Mother's Day, in days. I was making breakfast, humming softly to myself, when it hit me. No tightness in my chest, no replaying conversations in my head, just the quiet rhythm of an ordinary morning. The kettle whistled, sunlight spilled across the counter. I felt present. For years, my sense of peace had depended on whether everyone else was okay, whether they needed me, whether I'd done enough. Now, peace felt internal, private, mine. Mark and I settled into a new rhythm. We talked once a week, sometimes more, sometimes less. When he called, it wasn't always with an agenda. Sometimes he just wanted to tell me about a project at work or a recipe he'd tried and failed. I could hear the difference in his voice, less rushed, less guarded. One evening, he said something that stayed with me. "You know," he said, "I think I appreciate you more now than I did before." I smiled to myself. "Why's that?" "Because now," he said slowly, "I know you're choosing to be here, not just defaulting." I closed my eyes, letting that sink in. Lauren changed too, though in quieter ways. She was still careful, still measured, but there was less tension between us. When we spoke, it wasn't layered with unspoken calculations. Once she even thanked me, not for the money I didn't give, but for being honest when it was uncomfortable. "I didn't realize how much we were leaning on you," she admitted. "It wasn't fair." It wasn't an apology wrapped in guilt. It was an acknowledgement. And sometimes that's enough. Emily visited again the following spring. We took long walks through my neighborhood, pointing out houses, sharing stories that didn't feel rushed or obligatory. One afternoon, as we passed the old park where I used to take her as a child, she stopped suddenly. "I think I understand something now," she said. I waited. "You spent so much time making sure we were okay that we never learned to ask if you were." Her words weren't heavy. They were thoughtful, reflective. I nodded. "And I never taught you too." We stood there for a moment, the wind stirring the trees, children's laughter floating from the playground, the past and present coexisting quietly. The biggest change, though, was in me. I stopped over-explaining my choices. If I declined an invitation, I didn't follow it with an excuse. If I needed rest, I took it without guilt. When someone asked for help, I paused, not to calculate how to fix everything, but to check in with myself first. That pause became sacred. I filled my time with things that made me feel whole again. I joined a small book club at the local library, took a weekend pottery class, and laughed at my clumsy hands, planned that trip I'd been postponing. Nothing extravagant, just a place I'd always wanted to see. For the first time in years, my life felt like it belonged to me. At the next big family gathering, I noticed something else. People listened when I spoke. Not because I demanded attention, but because I no longer rushed to fill silences or smooth over discomfort. I spoke when I had something to say, and when I didn't, I was content to observe. My sister leaned over at one point and whispered, "You seem different." "I feel different," I replied. Later that night, as I washed dishes in my quiet kitchen, I thought about how easily this story could have gone another way. I could have given them the money, swallowed the hurt, told myself that was just part of being a mother. No one would have called me selfish, no one would have been upset, but nothing would have changed. The betrayal hadn't been forgetting Mother's Day. It hadn't even been the lie about money. The real betrayal would have been continuing to abandon myself for the comfort of others. I didn't stop loving my children. I just stopped disappearing inside that love. Now, when I look at my life, I don't see loss. I see balance. I see relationships that breathe instead of cling, love that's offered, not assumed, respect that grew from honesty instead of obligation. And most of all, I see a woman who finally learned that her needs were not an inconvenience. They were a responsibility, one she owed to herself. Sometimes, when the house is quiet and I sit in my favorite chair by the window, I think about how small moments carry enormous weight. A phone call, a text ignored, a word spoken or left unspoken. I look back on that Mother's Day and the days that followed, and I realize something important. The shock I gave my children wasn't cruel, it was necessary. And the shock I received, the one that made me sit up and examine how I had been living, was equally necessary. I used to think being a mother meant giving endlessly, without pause, without question, that my worth was measured in sacrifices no one ever noticed. And for a long time, I was proud of that. I thought it was strength. I thought it was love. But love doesn't demand your silence as proof. Strength doesn't require your erasure. And respect, true respect, can't be assumed. It has to be recognized. After I set those boundaries, after I asked for transparency and honesty instead of blind trust, something shifted in the family. Not immediately and not perfectly. There were stumbles, frustrations, hurt feelings, but the slow, quiet work of truth began to show its effects. Mark learned to face challenges without automatically turning to me as a financial safety net. He started having adult conversations with his wife about money, about responsibility, about expectations. I watched them stumble through it awkwardly at first, but steadily, with accountability. And I realized that struggle, that learning, was better for them than any check I could have written. Emily learned too. She began to understand the invisible labor of being present for someone, not just in the big, obvious ways, but in the quiet, small choices of acknowledging another person's needs. She apologized when it mattered, not out of guilt, but out of understanding, and that mattered far more than the hurt she had caused. And me? I learned that my boundaries were not walls, they were the foundation of healthier connections. I learned to say no without shame, to prioritize my well-being without guilt, to hold space for my love without losing myself in the process. Mother's Day is different now. It isn't about gifts, calls, or rituals that force me to measure love by attention. It's about recognition and presence, honesty and connection. It's about celebrating a life that continues, quietly, steadily, with dignity. I've kept the same blue mug I held the morning of that fateful phone call. I still make my toast a little too brown sometimes, still hum while washing dishes, still watch the world from that window. But I do it on my own terms now. The balance between giving and receiving feels fairer, more grounded. There are moments when I notice a twinge of the old frustration, the feeling of being overlooked, taken for granted. But these moments pass quickly because I know that I have learned the lesson that mattered most. Respect is not inherited, it's earned. Love is not unconditional in a way that sacrifices your soul, and a mother's place is never just a service. Sometimes I look at Mark and Lauren, careful, considerate, a little more grounded, and I smile. They learn that the world doesn't revolve around them. They learn to meet accountability with effort. And I know I played a part in that lesson, not by giving endlessly, but by asking them to face reality as it was. I look at Emily's face on the screen during our calls, seeing understanding where confusion used to live. I know that she's beginning to carry these lessons forward into her own life, that she'll remember how boundaries mattered, how honesty mattered, and how respect is a two-way street. And sometimes, late at night, I allow myself to marvel at the quiet transformation, not in them, but in me. The strength I discovered wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't the kind that demands attention. It was the kind that lets you sleep at night knowing that you've acted with integrity, with dignity, and with love. I've come to understand that life doesn't always reward the mother who gives without question. Sometimes life rewards the mother who pauses, who asks, who chooses carefully where her energy goes. Sometimes life rewards the mother who teaches through action, through quiet boundaries, and through calm, firm insistence that she matters too. So when Mother's Day comes around again, I pour my coffee into that chipped blue mug, I stand by the window, I smile, I breathe. I know that my love, now tempered with wisdom, is stronger than ever. Not because I gave, but because I gave wisely and demanded honesty in return. I tell myself that this is what I hope to teach all along, that love does not diminish you, that self-respect is not selfish, that the quiet power of saying. The months that followed felt like a slow, steady unfolding of a life I'd forgotten I could have. Mark and Lauren adjusted to their new routines. I watched from a distance, careful not to interfere unless they asked, and sometimes I caught glimpses of pride in Mark's voice, small hints of responsibility he carried where before he had relied entirely on me. Lauren softened in ways that weren't performative, subtle gestures, little acknowledgments, a newfound patience. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Emily visited more often, though the visits were tentative at first. She wanted to make sure she wasn't stepping back into the same pattern that had caused so much hurt. I let her in slowly. We talked openly about the past, about expectations, and about the lessons that sometimes take decades to learn. She laughed sometimes, softly, like relief had a sound, like finally being seen was enough to uncoil tension she hadn't realized she carried. I realized that what had seemed like a crisis, Mother's Day ignored, the sudden money request, had been a catalyst. It forced all of us to reckon with things we'd been avoiding for years: entitlement, assumptions, lack of communication, and it taught me something I hadn't known before. Love can thrive, but it can also suffocate. Boundaries, when applied with clarity, give relationships room to breathe. One afternoon, I was planting new flowers in the garden, hands dusty and wet, and Mark called. "Mom," he said, hesitantly, "I just wanted to say thank you for everything, for being firm, for giving me a chance to fix things. Shh, I said, laughing softly. "You don't have to explain everything. Just try to remember the lessons." "I will," he said. "I promise." And in that small exchange, I felt the years of tension ease, like a knot finally unraveling. I also discovered another truth. Letting go of being needed doesn't mean you stop being loved. It means the love becomes healthier, mutual, and genuine. That realization made space for me to rediscover my own needs, my own joys, and even my own mistakes without feeling shame. The house felt warmer than it had in years, not because of renovation or fresh paint, but because I no longer carried unspoken burdens. I had stopped bending to meet everyone else's expectations and started bending toward myself instead. Sometimes, late at night, I'd reflect on the shock that it changed everything. It hadn't come from a dramatic confrontation, not from yelling or threats. It came from a quiet refusal, a refusal to enable dishonesty, a refusal to be overlooked, a refusal to sacrifice my dignity for convenience. I realized then that this kind of shock is rare. It doesn't make headlines, it doesn't go viral, but it ripples through lives quietly, steadily, leaving lasting change in its wake. And for once, the ripple started with me. Looking back, I understood love is powerful, but it is not unconditional in the sense of being blind. Love asks for respect, honesty, and acknowledgement. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give your children is not the money, not the help, not even your approval, but the lesson that life has boundaries, and boundaries are where growth happens. I planted a row of marigolds along the fence, their bright orange faces lifting toward the sun. I thought about my children, and I thought about myself, and for the first time in years, I felt truly aligned. There was no resentment, no lingering frustration, just clarity. And that clarity, I realized, was worth more than any apology, any check, any outward display of recognition. I wasn't just surviving, I was living. The years that followed taught me more than any confrontation ever could. Mark and Lauren eventually stopped coming to me for quick fixes, for last-minute financial rescues, for the easy answer. They learned to manage, to communicate, to take responsibility. It wasn't perfect. There were still awkward moments, small frustrations, but it was real. And for the first time, I could watch them grow without feeling drained or resentful. Emily, too, changed. She started noticing things she hadn't before. How much effort goes unseen, how boundaries can teach respect, how love can be honest without being hurtful. She apologized again one afternoon, quietly, not with drama, but with understanding. I realized that was far more meaningful than any gift or card she might have sent on Mother's Day. For myself, life began to feel expansive. I had space again to think, to breathe, to enjoy the little things I had neglected. My mornings were slow, full of tea, the smell of fresh toast, the hum of the kettle. I took up gardening again, planting marigolds and herbs, tending them with care and patience. I even started a short weekend pottery class, laughing at my mistakes as the clay slipped through my fingers. I traveled quietly. A short trip to the coast I had dreamed of for years became my first solo adventure. I wandered along beaches, breathed the ocean air, watched the horizon, and felt a sense of freedom I hadn't realized I had lost. But the most important changes weren't external, they were internal. I learned that my boundaries didn't make me less loving, they made me stronger. I learned that saying no doesn't make you cruel. I learned that refusing to be taken for granted isn't selfish, it's necessary. And I discovered that love, when paired with honesty and respect, becomes something richer, something lasting. The next Mother's Day arrived quietly. I didn't wait by the phone. I didn't fret over whether Mark or Emily or Lauren would call. I made breakfast, brewed my coffee, and stood by the window, watching sunlight filter over the garden. Mark and Lauren showed up later that morning, small bouquet in hand, sheepish smiles, and a quiet, "Happy Mother's Day." Emily appeared on a video call, her face glowing on the screen. It wasn't dramatic. There were no tears, no overblown speeches, just recognition, just honesty. And it felt enough. They had learned the lessons, I had learned mine, and for the first time in years I felt truly seen, truly respected, and truly loved, not for what I could give, but for who I was. I realized that the shock of their lives, the shock of suddenly losing automatic access to my resources, to my silence, wasn't punishment, it was a gift. It taught them accountability. It taught me the power of my own voice. And in the quiet aftermath, we all became stronger. Sometimes I think about how easily this story could have gone differently. I could have given the money, swallowed the frustration, pretended everything was fine. It would have been easier for everyone else, but it would have cost me my peace, my voice, my dignity. And that's what I want to leave with you. Love is powerful, but it is not a blank check. Strength doesn't mean giving until you break. Boundaries aren't cruel, they are life-saving. You can be a mother, a parent, a partner, and still protect yourself. You can give and still say no. You can love and still demand respect. That's the lesson I learned. That's the lesson I hope my children learned. And that's the lesson I hope anyone listening to this story will carry forward in their own lives. Because in the end, it's not the gifts, the calls, or the apologies that matter most. It's the respect, the honesty, the willingness to grow and change together. I sip my tea and watch the garden sway in the morning light, and I smile quietly because I know this. I didn't just survive the shock of their lives, I grew because of it. And that makes all the difference. Would you have had the courage to pause, to demand honesty, to set boundaries, even with the ones you love most? Think about it, reflect, and remember, the strongest love is often the one that asks for respect first.